It was February 1943, the height of the Atlantic storm season, and the sea looked like it wanted to swallow the world. Waves rose like walls, crests shattering against the steel hull of U-553 as it clawed its way through the black water. Inside, red emergency lights pulled in the control room, bathing the faces of the crew in an eerie glow. Diesel engines groaned. The air stank of oil, sweat, and fear. Oberleutnant Zursee Helmut Hansen leaned over the periscope and saw nothing but chaos. Water exploding against the lens, wind screaming so loud it drowned the sound of his own breath. Yet he smiled. For all the fury of the Atlantic, for all the cold and darkness, this was his hunting ground. Somewhere out there, scattered across the endless waves, another Allied convoy was struggling toward Britain, slow, heavy, and blind in the storm. The Germans called it the England Lifeline. Hansen and his men called it target practice. He turned to his crew and shouted above the noise, "We'll wait for the storm to break." Then we struck. Another fat convoy, gentlemen, another 20,000 tons to the deep laughter, rippled through the cramped metal tube. The U-boat crews had reason to laugh. For 3 years they had ruled the Atlantic like wolves. Their admiral, Karl Dönitz, had built an invisible empire beneath the waves, a fleet of hunters who prowled the ocean lanes, sinking Allied ships faster than they could be built. Between 1940 and early 1943 they had sent more than 2,000 merchant vessels to the bottom. British supply lines bled daily. Food was rationed, fuel scarce, and London feared starvation more than invasion. Every submarine commander knew the math. Sink 15 ships a week, and Britain would collapse by year's end. It felt inevitable. In the officers' mess back in Lorient, the walls were decorated with tonnage boards, tallies of how much Allied shipping each U-boat had destroyed. The numbers looked like the scoreboard of a winning game. "The Atlantic is ours," Dönitz had declared, and most of the Kriegsmarine believed him. But inside the storm, the Atlantic cared nothing for confidence. The U-boat lurched violently as a wave slammed against its hull. Hansen grabbed the railing, barking orders. "Depth 10 meters. Hold course." Water seeped through the seams. The men tightened the valves and cursed. To them, the storm was another ally that hid them from radar, muffling the sound of their approach. In weather like this, the convoys moved blind, their escorts struggling to maintain formation. Somewhere on the horizon, beyond the roaring dark, Hansen knew 100 ships were crawling eastward. Freighters loaded with ammunition, trucks, canned meat, and aircraft parts. America's factories were feeding Britain, and the only thing standing in between was the U-boat arm. To the Germans, this wasn't just strategy, it was science. Dönitz's Wolfpack doctrine had turned submarine warfare into a mathematical art. Groups of U-boats hunted together, coordinated by radio, converging on convoys like predators on prey. Each commander memorized the same ritual: detect, shadow, signal, strike. The Wolfpack didn't sleep, it fed, and the results had been catastrophic for the Allies. Just months earlier, in November 1942, convoy PQ-17 had been torn apart in the Arctic seas. 24 ships sunk in a single operation. In Germany, newspapers hailed it as proof of U-boat supremacy. Posters in Berlin showed merchant ships burning under black skies, captioned with words like, "England's arteries cut." Even Hitler, usually unimpressed by naval warfare, began to boast that the Atlantic blockade would finish what the Blitz could not. Hansen believed it. Every commander did. The sea had become Germany's second front, and they were winning. But not everything the U-boat crews believed was true. The Allied convoys were not as fragile as the propaganda claimed. Far from it. They were getting faster, better armed, and more coordinated with each passing month. The men on the escorts, sailors aboard destroyers, corvettes, and sloops, were learning. And behind them, scientists in London and Washington were listening, decoding, and plotting every U-boat transmission. A silent counterattack was already forming beneath the Arrogance. Hansen didn't know it yet, but the storm around him wasn't just weather, it was shifting. As U-553 rolled in the waves, he grinned at his radio man. "We'll show them again, eh?" Another convoy sunk before dawn. The radio man smirked. "The British can build ships, but they can't build luck." The laughter came again, forced this time. The storm battered the hull harder. Somewhere inside the steel belly a rivet cracked. Salt water dripped onto the radio set, fizzing as it hit the circuitry. No one noticed. Hansen checked his watch. 0200 hours. The convoy would be near Grid Square AL 221 by morning. He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling in the draught. The crew relaxed, trading cigarettes and dark jokes. One man hummed a marching song, half under his breath. It was almost peaceful, until the hydrophone operator stiffened. "Herr Oberleutnant," he said quietly, "contact bearing 180, multiple screws." "Slow speed." "Convoy," Sir Hansen's grin widened. "Then the hunt begins." He didn't know that the convoy they were tracking wasn't alone. Over the horizon, waiting in silence, were 2 British destroyers equipped with new radar and depth-charge projectors the Germans still believed were experimental. The hunters were about to be hunted. By the winter of 1943, the German Navy believed the Atlantic had already been conquered. At the Grand Headquarters in Paris, Admiral Karl Dönitz stood before a map dotted with hundreds of tiny red pins, each marking a ship sent to the bottom. The wall looked like a constellation of victory, stretching from Greenland to Gibraltar. Every pin represented food that would never reach London, oil that would never reach the RF, weapons that would never reach the front. When visitors entered the room, Dönitz would smile thinly and say, "There lies England's future." His officers nodded because they believed it too. In 3 years, U-boats had sunk more than 12 million tons of Allied shipping. The math felt irresistible. Britain needed 1 million tons of imports a week to survive. The U-boats were sinking that much every month. It seemed only a matter of time before the island starved. Dönitz called it the tonnage war, and he played it like chess. Every U-boat was a piece on the board, moving silently through the grid squares of the Atlantic. His signals, officers plotted convoys based on intercepted radio traffic, weather reports, and sightings from long-range aircraft. Once a convoy was located, a single shadowing U-boat would follow at distance, transmitting its position. Others would converge on the coordinates, forming a wolf pack. When night came, they attacked together. Merchant ships burned one after another, their crew leaping into the black water. Survivors called it the night of the long torpedoes. To Dönitz, it was proof that science and discipline could strangle an empire. He had been a submarine himself in the last war, and he carried that identity like armour. "The U-boat is the purest weapon," he told a group of new commanders. "One crew, one machine, one purpose." Even in Berlin, where Hitler's attention had drifted toward tanks and rockets, Dönitz was respected as a man who delivered results. When other fronts faltered, the U-boat still scored kills. The press called him Der Löwe des Atlantiks, the Lion of the Atlantic. His strategy had elevated submariners to an elite caste. They wore their U-boat badges with quiet arrogance, believing they were the heirs of a new kind of warfare. In the ports of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and Brest, their pens were like temples, massive concrete fortresses impervious to bombs. At night, when the crews returned from missions, the French harbour lights flickered against the curved walls, illuminating lines of sailors standing at attention as Dönitz inspected them. The propaganda cameras always lingered on his calm face, and the gleam of the Iron Cross pinned to his uniform. Behind him, workers reloaded the U-boats with fresh torpedoes and supplies, ready to send them back out into the sea. The routine was mechanical, efficient, and unstoppable. To the Germans, the Atlantic War had become an equation, and every number favoured them. They calculated that even if the Allies doubled their shipbuilding, the U-boats could still sink more than the enemy could produce. They believed Allied defences were reactive and clumsy, that the convoys were slow, their escorts poorly trained. Reports from the front seemed to confirm it. Captains returned with stories of panic among British sailors, of ships scattering when attacked, of easy kills. "They are sheep," one commander wrote in his log. "We are the wolves." The arrogance grew with every success. Inside the officers' clubs in Paris, laughter echoed late into the night. They toasted each other with French wine, boasting about their tonnage totals. To them, the convoy war was already decided. The Allies could not possibly keep pace. They were fighting against mathematics, against inevitability. Dönitz himself said it plainly in a briefing that January. "If we maintain our current rate, the British merchant fleet will cease to exist by next winter." His staff applauded. But even as they cheered, the data had begun to shift. Allied production was accelerating beyond anything Germany had imagined. New American shipyards stretching from Maine to California were launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, sometimes one every 3 days from a single slipway. The British were improving too, developing escort groups that trained together for months instead of ad hoc formations thrown together at sea. Still, the Germans dismissed these reports. They called the Liberty ships floating coffins and mocked British tactics as desperate improvisations. In Dönitz's war diary, an aide wrote, "The enemy reacts, but reaction cannot overcome precision." In his mind, the Battle of the Atlantic was not chaos but order, and order was on his side. He never saw the irony, that his logic depended on static conditions in a war that was changing every hour. The Americans were learning to listen, the British to adapt, and the ocean itself was turning into a new kind of battlefield, one ruled not by torpedoes alone, but by information. But in early 1943 that shift was invisible. The officers at Lorient still lined up for photographs beside painted kill flags. The men still sang drinking songs about ships sinking in the moonlight. The storm of overconfidence grew stronger than any in the Atlantic. Even when U-boat losses began to rise slightly, Dönitz shrugged it off as the price of victory. "The enemy bleeds more than we do," he said calmly. His subordinates repeated it like scripture. No one wanted to admit that the sea, once a vast ally, was shrinking around every month, more dangerous, more predictable, more watched. To the Germans it still felt infinite, and their power still felt absolute. They couldn't know that the map of red pins on Dönitz's wall was already a museum piece, a relic of the time when the hunters believed they owned the ocean. The contradiction began quietly, almost invisibly, hidden beneath the noise of Dönitz's statistics and the triumphal reports from Lorient. In the spring of 1943, U-boat commanders started sending strange signal complaints about convoys that seemed to vanish from sight, torpedoes that missed, an aircraft that appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the Atlantic. The first to notice was Admiral Eberhard Gott, Dönitz's operations chief. He read the reports with a frown but said nothing. In Berlin, silence was safer than doubt, but the pattern was undeniable. Convoys were slipping past patrol lines that had always worked before. Boats were being destroyed faster than replacements could leave the docks. The wolf packs were beginning to starve. The Germans didn't know it yet, but they were fighting against an enemy that had turned invisible into a weapon. In a secret room in Bletchley Park, English cryptanalysts had been reading their mail. Every U-boat radio message, every Wolfpack order, every position report was being intercepted, decrypted, and sent to the Admiralty within hours. The Allies called it ULTRA, and it had changed the ocean into something entirely new. For 3 years, Dönitz's radio network had been the backbone of his war. He called it Triton, a system so efficient that hundreds of submarines could coordinate across millions of square miles of sea. But in 1943, the very precision that made it powerful became its flaw. The British didn't need to outfight the U-boats, they only needed to outlisten them, and so they did. In London, analysts built maps that mirrored Dönitz's own, but theirs were alive, shifting in real time as decrypted coordinates poured in. Where he saw dominance, they saw exposure. His wolfpacks were no longer predators, they were beacons. The first sign of that shift came in March, when convoy HX-229 crossed the Atlantic. 40 ships, loaded with oil and steel, moved through an area that had once been a graveyard for merchantmen. U-boats shadowed them as usual, signalling back to headquarters. But this time, the British escorts were waiting. As the submarines surfaced to attack at night, radar caught them like ghosts in a spotlight. Searchlights stabbed the waves and hedgehog mortars roared. U-boat after U-boat was forced down, hunted, and killed. The Germans managed to sink a few freighters, but 8 of their own were lost. It was the first time the hunters had more losses than their prey. Dönitz's staff dismissed it as coincidence, bad weather, or Allied luck. But luck doesn't repeat itself. The next month it happened again. Convoy ONS-5 became the moment the myth cracked. 42 ships bound for Halifax sailed straight through the middle of the U-boat's most successful hunting ground, and survived. In 5 days of combat, the Germans lost 7 submarines. The sea that once fed them now turned against them. For the first time, Allied sailors saw wreckages from the other side, bodies in black leather suits, floating among the oil slicks. They realized the wolves could bleed. Dönitz refused to believe it. He blamed defective torpedoes, bad intelligence, and even sabotage. He ordered more boats to sea, convinced that aggression alone could restore control, but the Atlantic had already shifted. What the Germans didn't understand was that the Allies had learned to see in the dark. New radar systems, small enough to fit on aircraft, could spot periscopes glinting in the moonlight. Ships carried HF/DF, high-frequency direction finders, that could pinpoint the location of a single radio transmission within minutes, and every time a U-boat reported its position, the ocean itself betrayed it. British scientists had even developed a secret weapon they called Fido, an acoustic homing torpedo that hunted submarines by sound. When dropped from the aircraft, it spiraled down through the water, listening to propellers. Once it heard them, it followed. No amount of diving or silence could save a U-boat once Fido had locked on. Donitz's empire of precision was becoming a death trap. For every new boat that sailed, another failed to return. In the pens at Lorient, wives and mothers came to the docks, waiting for faces that never appeared. The walls that once echoed with laughter now carried whispers. Engineers worked faster, building new models, the Type 7, the Type 9, but even their improved designs couldn't change the tide. The Allies now had long-range Liberator bombers closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the last refuge of the submariners. There was nowhere left to hide. Inside U-553, Helmut Hansen saw the change firsthand. During his patrol in May, his hydrophone operator reported a strange humming sound in the water. Moments later, depth charges exploded all around them, closer and more accurately than ever before. Hansen ordered a crash dive, but the explosions followed perfectly like footsteps. The lights flickered. One man screamed as a valve burst, flooding the forward compartment. They survived, barely. When they surfaced hours later, the storm had passed, but so had their confidence. "They knew where we were," Hansen muttered, "before we even fired." His radio man said nothing. He didn't have to. They both understood something had shifted in the ocean, something they couldn't explain. For the first time, Hansen thought about failure. He looked out across the empty water and realized he no longer felt like the hunter. He felt like he was bait. Back in Paris, Dönitz still stood before his map, adding red pins for every Allied ship sunk, unaware that the enemy now had one of their own maps, larger, clearer, and far more accurate. The Wolf Pack had lost the element of surprise, and no Steel Empire can survive without it. The storm of numbers came like a tide no admiral could command. In the spring of 1943, Dönitz's empire began bleeding in silence, one submarine at a time, one statistic after another. At first, the reports were small, a missing U-boat here, a failed attack there, but soon the gaps became holes, and the holes became the truth. Between March and May, the German Navy lost 41 submarines. That was more than in all of 1942. For every ton of shipping that sank, the cost of living grew heavier. The U-boat service, once a brotherhood of glory, was becoming a factory of ghosts. In the Atlantic, the hunters were vanishing beneath their own legend. The math that had promised victory now turned against them. For every U-boat sent to sea, 4 new Allied ships were launched. American shipyards in Maine, Maryland, and California worked day and night, building Liberty ships with an efficiency that defied logic. Welders joked that they could build a ship faster than the Germans could sink it, and for once, it wasn't an exaggeration. In 1941, it took nearly a year to build a freighter. By 1943, it took less than 2 months. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, once completed a Liberty ship in just 4.5 days. Dönitz's perfect equation, 15 sinkings a week to starve Britain, was collapsing under the weight of industrial reality. The Allies were winning not with tactics, but with time, steel, and sweat. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned into the largest production duel in human history. By the middle of 1943, America's factories were launching more than 8 million tons of shipping a year. Britain, still rationed and scared by bombings, was producing new escort ships at a record pace. Convoy escorts that once numbered 5 or 6 now sailed with 15 or 20. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates circled each convoy like a moving fortress. They had radar, sonar, and depth charges that reached deeper than ever before. For the U-boats, the ocean that had once felt limitless was now crowded with death. Even when they weren't being attacked, they were being watched. The statistics told the story before anyone admitted it. In 1942, U-boats sank 8.3 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1943, the number dropped to 2.4 million. And yet the cost to Germany had doubled. For every ton that sank, dozens of sailors were lost. Their average lifespan at sea was now less than 3 months. Some crews never even made it to their first patrol zone. They vanished between the Bay of Biscay and Iceland, swallowed by the very routes they once ruled. Still, Dönitz refused to change his tone. In public, he told his men they were turning the tide again. In private, his war diary began to show cracks. "Losses are heavy," he wrote in April. "The situation requires extraordinary measures." But there were no extraordinary measures left. Every weapon that once gave them superiority had been countered. Their torpedoes malfunctioned, their radios betrayed them, and the ocean that once hid them now revealed them through radar and sound. Even the weather no longer protected them. Allied aircraft equipped with ASV radar could spot a U-boat's periscope through clouds, rain, and fog. The Atlantic, once their greatest ally, had turned into an open-air trap. By May, the numbers became unbearable. The Kriegsmarine lost 37 boats in a single month, an entire flotilla. Dönitz ordered a temporary withdrawal from the North Atlantic, calling it a pause for tactical adjustment. But every sailor knew what it meant. They were losing the war of numbers, and no amount of courage could change arithmetic. Inside the U-boat pens, maintenance crews walked past rows of empty berths where submarines had once docked. The walls were covered with plagues bearing names: U201, U553, U359, boats that never came home. At night, the sound of air hammers and welding torches echoed through the empty corridors. The pens themselves, those massive bunkers of concrete and pride, had begun to feel like tombs. Across the ocean, Allied strategists were doing their own math. Admiral Max Horton, who commanded the western approaches, calculated that for every U-boat destroyed, hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo reached Britain safely. His staff turned those figures into morale posters for dockyards. One ship built, one victory earned. American newspapers published photographs of convoys stretching to the horizon, headlines declaring, "Supplies never stop." For once, the propaganda was true. By late 1943, the Allies had organised 4,000 convoys of massive synchronised fleets carrying everything from wheat to tanks. Each one was guarded by an invisible shield of code-breaking aircraft and coordination. The U-boats that approached were being funneled into kill zones, their old hunting grounds turned against them. Even their greatest tactical innovation, the Wolf Pack, had become predictable. The Allies knew the pattern, the timings, even the preferred attack angles. They had reduced Dönitz's masterpiece to an algorithm, and then broken it. In a single meeting that June, an exhausted staff officer told Dönitz, "Herr Admiral, the mathematics are no longer in our favour." Dönitz glared at him and said coldly, "Then we will redefine mathematics." But numbers are immune to willpower. No speech could replace the men who didn't return. No calculation could erase the ships that still arrived in British ports, stacked with crates labelled "From America with Steel." By autumn, the German Navy stopped publishing U-boat success reports. The charts that once glowed with confidence were hidden in drawers. For the first time since the war began, the Reich's most feared weapon had lost its purpose. In the end, numbers couldn't describe what it felt like to drown in the Atlantic. Only men could. The logbooks and diaries from that year read like fragments of a collective nightmare, written in cramped handwriting between alarms and explosions. On the German side, young sailors wrote about fear the way poets once wrote about love, obsessively, quietly, pretending not to feel it. A machinist aboard U359 recorded, "We smell of oil and metal. There is no air. When I close my eyes, I still hear the screws turning. When I open them, it's still dark." Another entry, found later in the wreckage of U441, simply said, "I dream of the sky." I haven't seen it in 19 days. These were boys, most of them 20 or younger, raised on stories of heroism and sent into the black belly of the sea. They sang the same marching songs as their fathers, but the melody had changed. The first verse was pride, the last was regret. Even the commanders who once laughed at convoys began to sense the change. Helmut Hansen, aboard U553, wrote one letter home before his final patrol. "The sea has become clever," he told his wife. "It knows where we are before we do." It was supposed to be a joke, but the sentence carried a chill. To the men trapped below, the Atlantic was no longer water. It was an enemy that listened. On the other side of that vast, listening to the ocean, Allied sailors kept their own diaries. Most of them never saw the faces of the men they killed. Their enemies were only echoes on sonar, faint lights on a radar scope, or dark shapes breaking the surface before vanishing again. Yet their words are filled with humanity. Lieutenant John Larkin, aboard HMS Dianthus, wrote, "When we find oil and bodies, I always wonder if they had mothers too. But then I remember the ships we lost last winter, and I aim true." For the convoy crews, survival itself was victory. Every safe arrival in Liverpool or Halifax felt like defiance. Merchant captains kept miniature flags to mark each crossing. They called them miracle runs, but miracles had a price. The North Atlantic was a graveyard of men who froze before they drowned. The survivors spoke of nights when the sea glowed faintly with burning oil, when the screams came through the fog and then they stopped all at once. A British sailor wrote in his journal, "The silence after a ship goes down is worse than the sound of it dying." The difference between them and the U-boat crews was only one perspective. Both were trapped in machines built for endurance, surrounded by water and death. Both fought in darkness. In 1943, the lines between hunters and hunted blurred completely. One British sailor described it perfectly. "It isn't war, it's blindness." The U-boats dove deeper, running silent for hours to avoid detection. The escorts circled endlessly, dropping depth charges into the empty sea. The men on both sides lived in cycles of waiting, listening, guessing. When a convoy passed without contact, the Allied crews celebrated with cocoa and cigarettes. When a U-boat survived a patrol, the Germans drank schnapps and played harmonica tunes in the wardroom. Both knew that the odds were closing in, and both pretended not to notice. What kept them fighting wasn't ideology, but habit. They obeyed orders, they followed procedure, and they trusted the machine until it betrayed them. In May, a young radioman aboard U-563 wrote, "The commander says the convoy is near. The hydrophone says nothing. The sea says nothing. Maybe the war is somewhere else now." His entry ended there. The boat was never heard from again. For the Allied sailors, the transformation was equally strange. Once terrified of the U-boats, they now hunted them with grim professionalism. Sonar operators listened to pings that meant life or death. The sound of a contact echo, that sharp metallic heartbeat, could send adrenaline through an entire ship. In the mess decks, the men joked that they were fighting ghosts. "You never see them," one wrote. "You just feel them die." But some did see them. During the rescue of survivors from U-662, which had been depth-charged and forced to surface, British sailors pulled half-drowned Germans from the freezing water. One of them, barely alive, whispered, "I thought we were the hunters." A petty officer replied quietly, "Not anymore." Then he handed him a blanket. Even in victory, the Allies learned to respect the courage of their enemies. Convoy commanders began to read captured U-boat logs, and many were shocked by their tone. Not monstrous, not cruel, just human. "They were boys like us," an escort officer admitted, "only trapped on the wrong side of the water." The ocean had no favourites. It took whoever lingered too long. By late 1943, both sides knew the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer about who ruled the sea, but who could endure it. Every man who stepped aboard a ship or submarine knew the odds. For the Germans, it was 1 in 4. For the British, not much better. Yet they went anyway, because that's what duty looked like in the middle of the world's coldest war. The logbooks, the letters, the fragments, they're all that remain now. They tell a story of faith, fatigue, and the quiet horror of realizing that the ocean doesn't care who wins. May 1943 would later be called Black May, but at the time, no one in Germany used that name. They still believed in recovery, in luck, in a sudden change of fortune. Dönitz had spent years feeding his men on that belief. The idea that the U-boat arm was unbreakable, that courage could compensate for everything else. But the Atlantic had stopped believing with him. In the first week of May alone, the Allies destroyed 31 U-boats. Entire wolf packs disappeared without a trace. The statistics that once crowned Dönitz now condemned him. At Lorient, the docks were quiet. The workers who had once painted victory emblems on returning submarines now scraped them off the walls. The harbour smelled of diesel and fear. Mothers still came to the pens, holding photographs of sons who would never surface. Inside his headquarters, Dönitz studied reports filled with words he had never seen before. Detected on radar, depth-charged to destruction, failed to report. His staff laid out charts showing new Allied coverage zones. The red ink spread across the Atlantic like a wound. For the first time, Dönitz understood that the ocean, his ocean, was no longer his. He sent a coded message to all boats. Withdraw from North Atlantic operations, regroup and await further orders. It was not a retreat in name, but everyone knew what it meant. The Battle of the Atlantic, the campaign meant to starve Britain, had been lost. Aboard the U-boat still at sea, the order came through in bursts of static. Some crews refused to believe it. Helmut Hansen read the message 3 times, staring at the thin strip of paper in his hands. "Withdraw," he said aloud. "From the Atlantic." His executive officer nodded. "We've lost too many." Hansen crumpled the paper. "Then the war is over for us." But even retreating was dangerous. As U-553 turned for home, British aircraft hunted the stragglers. The new Lee light bombers struck in darkness, dropping flares that turned night into day. The submariners, blinded and exposed, died without ever seeing their killers. In London, the news came differently. Admiral Max Horton walked into the operations room of the Western Approaches Command, where a massive wall map tracked every convoy and every sighted U-boat. For the first time, the blue markers, Allied ships, outnumbered the red ones. His staff burst into applause. Horton simply said, "Gentlemen, the Atlantic is open." It was a quiet statement, but it carried the weight of 4 years of fear. That night, Churchill wrote in his diary, "The convoys run unbroken." The lifeline holds. The shift was more than military, it was emotional. Allied sailors who once whispered prayers before each voyage now spoke of revenge. The ocean that had once been a graveyard felt like a promise. Convoy captains sent cables home reading simply, "Made it through." Again for Britain, survival was victory enough. For Germany, survival was now impossible. The U-boat fleet, once nearly 400 strong, was being dismantled by its own momentum. Every mission consumed fuel, men, and faith. The crew who returned found the harbours strangely empty. Dönitz walked the pens in silence, touching the cold steel of the few surviving boats. "You have done your duty," he told one commander. "The enemy has learned too quickly." He didn't say what everyone else knew, that it was over. By summer, the statistics were undeniable. In May, Germany lost 41 U-boats, in June 34, in July another 25. More than 5,000 men disappeared beneath the waves. They called it the Untergang, the downfall. The ocean had become a grave that stretched from Greenland to Gibraltar. Inside Berlin, the High Command stopped asking for reports from Dönitz. Submarine warfare, once the pride of the Reich, had turned into a bleeding wound that no one wanted to look at. But defeat has a sound, and in 1943 it echoed like thunder over the Atlantic. Every Liberty ship that reached Liverpool carried more than cargo. It carried proof. Proof that industry could outbuild ideology, that information could outfight intimidation. The convoys that Dönitz once mocked now moved in endless chains, guarded by aircraft, destroyers, and technology born of desperation. They carried food, fuel, and faith to an island that refused to die, and in doing so they wrote the obituary of the U-boat empire. On August 1st, U-553 was spotted by a Liberator patrol south of Greenland. Hansen ordered a dive, but the ocean gave them away. Depth charges rained down like thunderbolts. The lights flickered, pipes burst, and the pressure gauge shattered. Hansen shouted for the crew to surface, but the order came too late. The hull imploded, and the sea closed over them without a sound. Their final coordinates were never recorded. Back in Germany, Dönitz received the report with a blank stare. He signed the loss notice mechanically, adding it to the growing stack on his desk. Then he turned to his aide and said, "They fought like lions." The aide hesitated. "Yes, Herr Admiral." Dönitz looked down at the map of the Atlantic, the same one he had once called his kingdom. "The pins are gone now. The board was clean." "We have nothing left to hunt," he said quietly, "and nothing left to save." That was the moment the Atlantic War ended. Not with a surrender, not with an announcement, but with silence. The silence of a fleet that no longer answered its own radios. The silence of an ocean that had buried its predators. In the years to come, historians would argue over when the Battle of the Atlantic was truly won, but the men who fought it didn't need dates. They remembered the moment the laughter stopped, when even the sea seemed to turn against them. The aftermath of the Atlantic War was not victory in the way the newspapers imagined it. There were no parades across the ocean, no cheering crowds on the docks. The men who survived simply arrived home and slept. For Britain, survival itself was triumph enough, The convoys kept moving one after another, their paths now guarded by an invisible net of radar, aircraft, and mathematics. The sailors no longer watched the horizon for periscopes. They watched it for land. The fear that had once ruled every crossing began to fade, replaced by something quieter, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. The same sea that had nearly starved them was now their lifeline. The same storm that once killed them now carried salvation. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic was a machine of Allied logistics so vast that even Churchill called it a miracle of organisation. Every week, hundreds of ships crossed between America and Europe, carrying everything from butter to bombers. What began as desperation had become discipline. British escort groups perfected their tactics, operating in precise coordination with air cover and intelligence from Bletchley Park. American shipyards flooded the ports with new hulls faster than the cranes could unload them. The U-boats, once a symbol of terror, were now little more than background noise in a symphony of industrial power. Inside his office in Paris, Dönitz still signed orders, but they had lost meaning. He had shifted his strategy to the Bay of Biscay and the Arctic routes, hoping to harass smaller convoys, but the great Atlantic lanes were gone. The wolf packs, once 20 strong, were now 2 or 3 desperate survivors clinging to old patterns. He sent memos to Hitler describing the need for technological redress, new submarines, faster and deeper diving with snorkels that could hide from radar. But the factories that might have built them were already in ruins, bombed night after night by the same supplies the convoys had delivered. The circle was complete. The very materials the U-boats had tried to stop were now destroying the cities that built them. In Britain, the men who had guided the convoys received a little celebration. They were tired, older, and hollow-eyed. Admiral Houghton rarely gave speeches. When asked what won the Atlantic, he said only, "We learned faster." The victory was not about bravery alone, but about adaptation. Radar operators who once struggled with static could now read enemy bearings in seconds. The escort commanders who once guessed at submarine positions now triangulated them with cold precision. Every battle, every loss had been data. Every improvement had been written in blood. The ocean itself became an archive of the war. The wrecks of U-boats littered the seabed like punctuation marks at the end of a long argument. Some were upright, as if still waiting for orders. Others were shattered, their decks peeled back by pressure and fire. Divers who found them decades later said the interiors were eerily intact. Cups still on tables, boots lined neatly by bunks, instruments frozen mid-measurement. The silence of those metal tombs was the silence that followed Dönitz's defeat. But in 1944, that silence spoke in another way. The Allied convoys had grown so confident that they no longer sailed with fear. They sailed with purpose. They carried not only goods but armies, the men and machines that would retake Europe. Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, was the ultimate consequence of the Atlantic victory. Every landing craft, every tank, every bullet fired on Normandy's beaches had crossed that ocean unopposed. The soldiers who stormed ashore never knew how many invisible battles had been fought before they arrived. The Battle of the Atlantic had not been a single campaign. It had been the foundation of them all. For the Germans, the aftermath was quieter but crueler. The surviving U-boat crews returned home to a country collapsing in slow motion. The same officers who once toasted victories now avoided each other's eyes. In the ports, the smell of oil still lingered, but the pride was gone. Dönitz visited the pens one last time, shaking hands with sailors whose faces were half his age. "The sea took everything," one of them said softly. Dönitz replied, "It took everything because we gave it everything." It was the closest he would come to admitting defeat. By 1944, only a fraction of the U-boat fleet remained operational. The rest was sunk, captured, or rusting in the dock. The Allies had complete control of the sea, and the German High Command knew it. The convoys that once crawled in fear now moved like clockwork. On some routes, not a single ship was lost for months. The statistics that once favoured the Reich now mocked it. Where Dönitz had once measured victory by tons sunk, the Allies now measured it by tons delivered, and the number was endless. In Liverpool, the sailors of the Merchant Navy gathered at the pierhead, watching ships come and go. Some of them had made more than 20 crossings. They no longer kept flags to mark their runs. There were too many to count. "We don't think of it as war anymore," one of them said. "It's just work that never stops." That was the real legacy of the Atlantic campaign, turning chaos into routine, terror into process. The men who survived didn't see themselves as heroes. They were tired workers in the machinery of endurance. As the war rolled toward its conclusion, the Atlantic grew strangely peaceful. The waves still rose and fell, the fog still drifted, but the fear had drained from the water. The convoy escorts sailed not as guardians of survival, but as carriers of victory, and somewhere beneath them, in the cold dark where sound travels farther than light, the wrecks of U-boats lay in neat rows, like soldiers at attention. Each one told the same story, that arrogance is not invincible, that technology without humility leads only downward. The hunters had been buried by their own precision, and the convoys they mocked had become the arteries of a world reborn. The meaning of the Atlantic War was never about ships alone. It was about what happens when humans meet the machinery of industry and pride. Every nation that fought in that ocean believed it was fighting for survival, but the Atlantic had its own definition of endurance. For the Germans, victory had been measured in tonnage sunk, in numbers written on chalkboards, in reports signed with precision. They believed war could be reduced to mathematics and discipline. But mathematics cannot account for adaptation. The Allies learned that faster than anyone. Their strength wasn't perfect. It was persistence. They failed, learned, rebuilt, and returned stronger each time. The ocean rewarded that kind of stubbornness. It punished those who confused certainty with control. The U-boats had started the war as hunters. They ended it as cautionary tales. When Dönitz looked at the Atlantic, he saw a grid, a geometry of destruction. He believed that if he could fill it with enough boats, he could choke the world into submission. But the Atlantic was not geometry. It was chaos. It shifted daily with weather, wind, and human ingenuity. It favoured those who could change with it. The Allies learned to think like water, fluid, reactive, impossible to pin down. Their convoys were not just ships. They were living systems. Radar, sonar, aircraft, and intelligence worked together like organs in a single body. Each failure became feedback. Each loss was absorbed and corrected. That was the quiet genius of the Atlantic campaign, the realization that survival itself can be a strategy. In the end, the convoys were more than transport. They were symbols. Every ship that reached port carried proof that democracy could fight an industrial war without losing its soul. Every crate of food, every barrel of oil was a vote of confidence in the idea that free nations could outthink and outbuild empires of fear. When Churchill called the merchant sailors the heroes who fed the fire, he wasn't exaggerating. Without them, every victory that followed, from Sicily to Normandy, would have been impossible. The Atlantic didn't just feed Britain, it fed history. For Germany, the meaning was darker, but no less profound. The U-boat war revealed the limits of faith in machines. The submariners had believed their vessels were invincible, their tactics infallible, their will unbreakable. But perfection is fragile. One broken code, one new radar wavelength, one factory working a little faster, and the balance shifted forever. The men who went down with their boats weren't victims of incompetence. They were victims of certainty. They had placed their trust in numbers, and numbers betrayed them. The ocean is not impressed by precision. It respects only endurance. The Atlantic also revealed something deeper about civilization itself. This was the first true global war fought as a battle of systems: logistics, production, information, technology. The Allies' victory was not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, in the shipyards, in the classrooms where engineers and scientists turned ideas into weapons. The convoys were arteries in a body of industrial democracy that had learned to survive by sharing knowledge faster than it could be destroyed. Dönitz's empire of secrecy, for all its discipline, couldn't compete with that. The Wolfpack was a symbol of unity without flexibility. The convoy was the opposite: messy, diverse, yet impossible to kill. That contrast is why one survived and the other didn't. For the sailors who lived through it, the meaning was simpler. They learned that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the act of stepping back onto the deck after watching another ship burn. Sometimes it's trusting the machine one more time, even after hearing it groan under pressure. The British called it carrying on. The Americans called it getting the job done. The Germans, when they could still speak of it, called it Schicksal, fate. But it was the same thing: persistence. When the war ended and the seas calmed, historians tried to define what the Battle of the Atlantic had truly decided. Some said it was the victory of science over instinct. Others said it proved the supremacy of American industry. But those are surface answers. The real meaning lies deeper, under the water where the wrecks still rest. It's the story of how humanity learned to think collectively, to merge courage with calculation and emotion with engineering. The Atlantic was not just a war theatre, it was a laboratory of civilization. Even today the ocean remembers. In the shipping lanes where convoys once sailed, sonar still picks up echoes from below. Metal hulls lying silent on the seabed, their coordinates marked only in archives. Each one is a reminder that victory is never absolute, only inherited. The convoys didn't destroy the U-boats, they outlasted them. That is the quiet lesson the Atlantic still teaches. Endurance wins because it keeps learning. The German generals laughed at 4,000 convoys, but the convoys never stopped coming. That was their secret. They didn't need to win every battle, they just needed to keep moving. The legacy of the Atlantic War reached far beyond 1945. When the guns went silent and the flags came down, the ocean kept its memories. The men who survived became teachers, engineers, and shipbuilders. The weapons they had used in desperation became the foundations of a new age of technology. Radar turned into weather mapping. Sonar became oceanography. The convoys, once symbols of desperation, became blueprints for global trade routes. And the U-boats, those dark steel predators, evolved into something else, machines of deterrence rather than destruction. The Cold War would be fought by submarines that no longer hunted ships, but silence itself. In that sense, the Battle of the Atlantic never truly ended. It just changed frequencies. In the early 1950s, naval engineers from both sides, Allied and German, began studying the lessons of the U-boat war. The Germans, defeated but respected for their engineering, were quietly invited to consult on submarine design for NATO. The Type 21, developed too late for battle, became the father of every modern submarine built afterward. It could stay submerged for days, move faster underwater than on the surface, and run almost silently. The Americans and British adopted its principles, building fleets that would carry nuclear missiles instead of torpedoes. The irony was brutal. The same minds that had once tried to starve Britain now helped design the ships that would defend it. Dönitz himself lived long enough to see that future. After serving 10 years in prison, he retired quietly to a village near Hamburg. In interviews, he said he felt no regret, only inevitability. "We were professionals," he told a reporter. "We did what we believed was possible." The enemy simply believed more. For Britain, the legacy was endurance turned into infrastructure. The convoy system became the backbone of post-war logistics, influencing everything from civilian shipping to humanitarian relief. Merchant sailors who once dodged torpedoes now carried reconstruction supplies to Europe. The same routes that had been battlefields became lifelines for peace. The Allied navies that once fought to protect convoys merged into NATO, task forces designed to keep the seas free. Freedom of navigation, once a wartime necessity, became an international principle. The ocean that had divided nations now connected them. For the United States, the lesson was scale. The war had proven that industry could be a weapon as powerful as any bomb. The shipyards that built Liberty ships turned into building tankers, cargo liners, and carriers. The rhythm of production never stopped. It just changed its purpose. The miracle of mass production that once saved Britain now fueled the American century. The Liberty ship had been mocked as cheap and disposable, but its simplicity became its strength. Decades later, when historians tried to measure which single weapon had done the most to win the war, many pointed not to a tank or plane, but to that humble freighter, a ship built by ordinary men and women thousands of miles from the front, whose only goal was to keep moving forward. The Atlantic itself changed character. Where it had once been a battlefield, it became a bridge. The underwater wrecks were not erased but absorbed, part of the seafloor's new landscape. Fishermen occasionally pulled up relics, corroded bolts, unexploded shells, a piece of periscope glass. Each one was a reminder that the ocean remembers differently than humans do, and keeps everything. The sea does not celebrate victory, it achieves it. For Germany, the legacy was heavier. The myth of the U-boat had been both its pride and its curse. In the post-war years, surviving submariners gathered quietly in veterans' halls, sharing stories over beer and silence. They didn't speak of glory anymore. They spoke of youth, of faces they couldn't forget, of nights when the hull creaked and they thought of home. Many felt no hatred for the men who had hunted them. Some even exchanged letters with Allied sailors. "We were all prisoners," one wrote, "only our cages were different." Over time, the bitterness dissolved into a kind of shared respect. At memorials in Kiel and Liverpool, former enemies stood side by side, saluting the same horizon. The lessons of the Atlantic spread into every sea thereafter. During the Cold War, naval officers studied Donitz's mistakes and Houghton's triumphs like scripture. They learned that information beats courage, that adaptation beats arrogance, and that the sea belongs to no one. Submarines became quieter, deeper, and deadlier, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer tools of conquest, they were guardians of balance. The sonar pings that once signalled death now served as warnings, echoes in a new kind of peace. In classrooms and command centres, the phrase, "the convoy wins the war," became doctrine. Military academies taught it not as a slogan, but as truth. Every modern logistics chain, from humanitarian airlifts to space missions, owes something to that idea. Coordination, communication, resilience. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just a victory. It was a manual for survival in complexity. It showed the world that wars are not won by single blows, but by endurance repeated thousands of times. And yet, beyond all the strategy and science, there was still something human in its legacy. The ocean, once feared, became a place of remembrance. The wrecks of U-boats and merchant ships became memorials beneath the waves. In some places the sea glows faintly at night, where oil still seeps slowly from rusted hulls. Divers say it smells faintly of metal and time. The ocean, they say, never forgets. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic taught the world that survival is not a miracle, it's a method. The convoys proved that courage could be organised, and the U-boats proved that arrogance could not. The German generals had laughed at 4,000 convoys, but those convoys carried not just supplies, they carried civilization. And if ships still move across the sea, if nations still depend on each other for life, the echo of that laughter will remain beneath the waves, answered forever by the sound of engines that never stopped coming. When you stand at the edge of the Atlantic today, it is hard to imagine what happened there. The waves roll in quietly, as if nothing remembers. But the truth is, the ocean always remembers. Beneath its surface lies an entire history, written not in words, but in steel and salt. Thousands of ships, merchant vessels, destroyers, submarines, sleep in its cold depths, their stories compressed into rust and silence. Each one is a monument to a time when the world's fate depended on men who lived and died by the rhythm of engines and the sound of sonar. If you could listen closely enough, you might still hear it. The heartbeat of the convoys, the muffled echo of torpedoes, the faint murmur of men who once believed they ruled the sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a story of heroes and villains, it was a story of endurance. It taught that courage is not the absence of fear, but persistence despite it. It taught that arrogance is brittle, and that survival belongs to those who learn. It was never a clean war. It was fought in darkness, against an enemy no one could see, across a battlefield that never stayed still. But in that chaos, humanity discovered something profound. It learned that progress is not built on certainty but on adaptation. The Germans believed in precision. The Allies believed in persistence. In the end, it was persistence that crossed the ocean. For the men who fought it, the Atlantic became a second home and a grave. The British sailors who steered through storms, the Americans who welded ships by night, the Canadians who guarded convoys through the fog, the Germans who dove beneath the waves believing they were invincible. All of them were part of the same vast equation. None could see the whole picture. They only felt their small part of it. Yet together, unknowingly, they defined the century. The convoys that never stopped coming didn't just save a nation. They built a world where connection itself became the foundation of power. Every ship that crosses the seas today is a descendant of those wartime convoys. Every radar screen, every sonar ping, every global network that keeps trade alive carries the ghost of that lesson. That endurance is the truest form of strength. Sometimes, the most important victories are the quiet ones, the ones measured not in battles won, but in journeys completed. The German generals had laughed at 4,000 convoys, certain that no nation could sustain such effort. But the convoys kept sailing, day after day, through storms, through darkness, through loss. And each time they reached the docks, they proved a simple truth, that the will to continue is more powerful than the will to conquer. The laughter faded, the U-boats sank, and the Atlantic became not a barrier but a bridge. If you visit the memorials along the coastlines of Liverpool, Halifax and Kiel, you'll find the same names carved into stone, names of sailors from every side bound forever by the same ocean. There is no sound there except the wind and the sea, but if you close your eyes, you can feel the echo of engines beneath your feet, as if the convoys are still passing below, endless and patient. History often forgets the quiet victories, but the ocean never does. It keeps them safe in its depths, where arrogance cannot reach and time cannot erase. In that sense, the Atlantic remains a teacher. It reminds us that progress is not the triumph of one side over another, but the triumph of learning over repetition. The convoys were not symbols of perfection, they were symbols of improvement. Each voyage was a lesson, each storm a test, each sinking a painful step toward understanding. And when the last U-boat went silent, when the laughter finally stopped, what remained was not dominance, but wisdom. So the next time you see a ship crossing the horizon, think of them, the sailors who fought the longest battle of the war and turned the sea itself into a symbol of endurance. The German generals had measured victory in numbers, the convoys measured it in persistence. One counted how much they could destroy, the other counted how much they could carry. In the end, the side that carried more, hope, courage, supplies, faith, was the one that endured. That was the secret the Atlantic whispered all along. And if the ocean still has a voice, it speaks softly, in the sound of waves against the shore. Keep moving, keep learning, keep coming. Because that is how the convoys won, not by fighting harder, but by never stopping.